Welcome to the Modern Husbands podcast, where any combination of Dr. Bruce Ross, Christian Sherrill, and Brian Page host national experts who share winning ideas to manage money and the home as a team. I'm Brian Page, founder of Modern Husbands. Sometimes our listeners want more support than a podcast can give, individual or couple support, which I now provide. Details can be found at modernhusbands.com. For today's podcast, we welcome Dr. Kentaro Fujita, a professor of psychology and director of the Decision Sciences Collaborative at The Ohio State University. He received his bachelor's in psychology at Harvard and his master's and PhD in psychology at NYU. He is an expert in motivation, goals, behavior change, and decision-making. Much of his award-winning research explores self-control. That is, who, when, and why do some succeed and others fail at resisting immediate temptations that undermine more distant goals. We'll explore how self-control shapes the way couples handle money, divide household responsibilities, and support each other through everyday challenges. Dr. Fujita will share research-backed strategies to strengthen willpower, reduce temptations, and stay focused on the big picture, both individually and as a team. Enjoy the show. Dr. Fujita, thank you for joining today.
I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about this because I know not all of our listeners have seen the light and recognize that The Ohio State University is the best school out there. But I have a special appreciation for the fact that a faculty member of around, 20 years from The Ohio State is joining.
It's a real pleasure. And for your readers, you can let them, for your listeners, you can let them know that Ohio State's Department of Psychology is indeed rated quite highly. And so it's not just our football team, and it's not just the reputation among our undergraduates, but it's also the reputation of our professionals as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. The epitome of greatness in universities. So sorry for anybody up there who's listening from the school up north, but we will dive straight into the podcast content today. And I'm really excited about talking about this because so much about what couples do when they're managing their lives, like relationally, the domestic labor, money, their careers, it has to do with self-control, right? And in my area of expertise, a lot of that focuses on essentially how you don't have to exert willpower, creating systems that kind of automate good choices and make bad choices more difficult. Because we know willpower is just like self-control is a really tough thing to do consistently. So I was really excited to read the article in the New York Times where you shared your thoughts and instantly reached out to you because I know that there's so much great value to what you have to say and your wisdom and how it's applicable to managing money in the home as a team. So let's start with just understanding self-control and that you've studied it obviously extensively. How do you define self-control and why is it such an important factor in our daily lives, particularly for couples managing money and household responsibilities?
It's a great question. There isn't actually consensus in the field about what self-control is, but I will tell you the way that my lab and my colleagues approach self-control and its relationship to willpower. So self-control can be thought of as the foregoing of immediate rewards in order to obtain more distant goals. The most common self-control conflicts that people might experience may be those that pit smaller sooner versus larger later rewards. So for example, would you prefer to have $5 today or $20 a year from now? Now, you asked why self-control is so important. Well, the ability to think beyond the here and now is believed to be one of the things that makes human unique and that has given us an evolutionary advantage over other organisms. The point is that we aren't driven by things that are immediately in front of us, but we can instead think about alternative realities and perhaps more importantly, plan for them. Right? So self-control allows us to capitalize on this skill and make decisions that are beneficial for us, perhaps not in the immediate, but in the long. So I'm not an expert in money management or marital conflict, but my own experiences as a husband suggest that marriage often requires us to prioritize things that are outside the here and now. So we may have to forego a really nice dinner tonight in order to save money for that really nice vacation next year. We may have to resist that temptation to react and lash out at our spouse for nagging us in order to maintain harmony and respect in our relationship. We may also have to eat the cost of a maintenance on our house now so that we don't have to worry about bigger repair bills later, and so on and so forth. So I think self-control is not limited just to the marital context, but it obviously, I would think from my own experiences, that it plays a really...
Is it something you're naturally good at?
I'm not sure that I would say I'm better or worse than anyone else. One of the observations that my research has led me to make is that I actually think we are better at self-control than we think we are. So, we get up in the morning when we're supposed to get up. We get to work. When we eat, we might splurge every now and then, but it's not like we're just eating junk all the time. We're not smoking opium when it's available to us. We're not drunk all the time when we're supposed to be taking care of our kids. So I think we do a pretty good job at self-control. I think the reason why everyone thinks they're not good at it is that we remember all the times when it was hard and we fail. And when we think about our own self-control, we remember the failures much more than the everyday successes. And so I think most of us probably think our self-control is not as good as it probably objectively is. Are there individual differences in self-control? Yes. Are some people better and worse than others? Probably. And I think there is some research to suggest that. But I do think as a species, I think as a whole, we underestimate actually how good we are.
When you said there's research to suggest that you can be born with more self-control, my mind goes straight to the Walter Mischel's Marshmallow Study. I read his book. It was really good. But then I also read something out of the University of Rochester that provided important context that could perhaps dispute his claims. Can you share? I'm sure you're well familiar with both of those studies. Can you share a little bit about both?
Happy to talk about it. So Walter Mischel conducted some of the most important research on self-control. He referred to it as delay of gratification in the 70s and 80s. What he did was he had children sit down and he presented them with a small immediate reward. We could just use the example of a marshmallow because that's the one that's often used. So he gave him one marshmallow and he put it on a plate and he said he was going to leave the room. And if the child could wait until he got back, he would give them two. And what he showed was that all children struggle with this, but some children were able to wait longer than others. I think the thing that catches most people's attention with this research is that he later conducted research where he followed up with the kids that were in these initial experiments. And those kids who were able to wait longer tended to have much better life outcomes. They went to better schools, they got better grades, they made more money, and they were happier in their relationships, and they were less likely to be incarcerated. So it suggested that self-control appears to predict a lot of really positive and important life outcomes. Amazing finding, obviously got a lot of attention, and so more recently, some scientists tried to replicate or reproduce these results. One of the nuances I think that does not get picked up as much as it needs to is that this group did replicate these results. So the marshmallow test or tests like it does in fact predict outcomes for children several years later. The big question though is whether it's really self-control that predicts these really positive outcomes or other things like parental income and social economic status and educational opportunities. It's important to point out that the Mischel group never claimed that self-control itself predicts these outcomes. They said that self-control predicts these outcomes, but they never said it's the only thing that predicts these outcomes.
Right.
And it's still the case that in the Rochester studies, if you just looked at self-control and you saw whether it predicted outcomes, it does. But could this relationship be explained by lots of other things? The answer is yes. I think I need to make one other observation about the original Walter Mischel studies was that subsequent experiments have shown that what's really critical in these experiments, for them to really show willpower, the child has to trust the experimenter. So if the child either doesn't like the experimenter or comes from a background where they're basically taught to not trust strangers, so for example, lower SES communities or more dangerous communities, for example, these children, if they don't trust the experimenter, then it makes perfect sense to eat the marshmallow now because you don't trust that you'll get the larger later ones later. So these experiments could also not only be about self-control, but they could also be about trust. And this is a very important nuance because now the delay that children can wait is not necessarily self-control, but rather how much they trust the other person. So, we have to take into account all of these nuances when we think about these experiments. But if they are done correctly, I do think that the original Walter-Mischel studies do reveal quite a lot about self-control, and we can still learn from them.
Which we're going to get into, because that's what I found fascinating about his book, was the strategies that the children kind of intuitively employed to exhibit self-control that can be learned, frankly. And before you dive into it, my immediate takeaway was, like hot and cold. Like he was like, look, the marshmallow's right in front of you. It's kind of hot. It's something you can eat right now. And it was metaphorical hot, but
yes.
And my thought was, well, gosh, this is simple. If let's say I'm married and there's no kids and my wife's on the same page as me as far as what we eat, I don't have the willpower to not eat a steak and that is directly in front of me, but because it's hot, I can eat it right there, right? But I have the willpower to purchase the right foods at the grocery store. And so then what I'm eating in the home is always going to be healthy because I don't have to exert self-control.
Yes, I think you're right on the ball on this, Brian, and many of the thoughts that you have are very similar to the thoughts that I have about self-control. And in fact, a lot of my work is inspired by Walter Mischel's early work. For your listeners, I wanted to just clarify some of our use of terms. So again, self-control is the foregoing of immediate rewards in favor of more distant goals. Now, we might think self-control is synonymous with willpower, but I think we have to be really careful about that. Willpower refers to the tactic or strategy of using our sort of inner resources or inner strength to sort of push down thoughts, feelings, and behavior in favor of the temptation, right? So if I have a thought that says like, hey, I really want to eat that steak, willpower sort of involves those thought processes that are necessary to say, no, you don't, and to sort of push down that urge that I really wanted. That process, which is sometimes referred to as effortful inhibition, is believed to require a lot of effort, a lot of energy, a lot of, you have to put a lot into it, you have to work really hard. And it also is supposed to require a lot of cognitive architecture. So I need a lot of my brain to be able to, I need more of my brain to be able to think about that. If I'm distracted, if I'm emotional, if I'm dual tasking, I won't have the resources or the hardware necessary to accomplish that. So willpower requires both motivational and mental resources to execute effectively. It's very hard. It can take time, but given the right set of circumstances, it can be successful. But given how hard it is, and given how sensitive it is to circumstances, right? You can't be distracted, you can't be emotional, you can't be dual tasking. It's highly fallible. And as a result, we shouldn't be surprised when people report that sometimes willpower is effective, but more times than not, it's not effective, and that people fail. For this reason, a lot of researchers, me included, have been arguing for people to work smarter, not harder. In other words, to leverage other strategies that we might have for countering temptation other than depending on our inner resources. You mentioned one, Brian, right? We can avoid encountering the situation in the first place. So if you are trying to lose weight or try to eat healthier, don't buy the unhealthy food. Don't have it in the house. Sometimes that's impossible. Like you go to a restaurant and they give you the menu and that's what's calling out to you. There are other mental strategies that you can use to try to overcome that willpower. So for example, you might think of a steak as a sinful indulgence. And labeling it that way takes away some of its magical pull, right? Alternatively, if you think of like the icing on a cake as like a blob of fat, again, that's sort of a way of mentally reframing the temptation in a way that makes it less attractive. One way that my colleagues and I have been really excited about is sort of mentally simulating the perspective of people who we respect or admire or who we'd like to be like. I think a common way that many Christians, for example, might do this is by asking, what would Jesus do? And this insight comes from a study that some of my colleagues at the University of Minnesota conducted, in which they had kids do this really tedious task while they could also do this more interesting video task. Imagine, the equivalent of like either you can do this homework or you can watch YouTube. And they had, in the critical condition, they had kids put on a costume of their favorite hero. So think Dora the Explorer or Batman. So they would put on Batman's cape and cowl. And then they would ask the kids, when you are tempted, we want you to ask the question, what would Batman do? And the kids who asked themselves this question, again, because they admire Batman and they wanted to be like Batman, were much more likely to do the tedious task than to do the fun task. And I think this also applies to adults. The other day, I was driving and I was experiencing a little bit of road rage. And as it was sort of bubbling up, what I thought about was my 16-year-old niece who looks up to me as a role model. And I asked myself, is this the kind of behavior that I would want her to see? And the answer was no. It completely reframed the situation. I wasn't tempted to lash out anymore because it helped me sort of get out of my head and take a different perspective. And that perspective was more of the perspective of the future me than the present me. So all of this to say that humans have at their disposal a number of tools that they can use to counter temptations that are not willpower, that at times can be easier and may actually be more effective. The trick, however, and I think this is the challenge, is finding the right strategy for you at that moment, at the right time. And this is the more difficult challenge. And right now, the state of the science is that we don't really have good answers for you, which unfortunately is part of the obstacle.
Is there, and really what you're driving at is when we feel threatened or fearful, or, we're using that primal part of our brain, but when we're being thoughtful and intentional, we're using the thinking part of our brain. It's a very simplistic thing to say, but is there something that you do personally to kind of switch gears from, let's go back to your road rage example of where you're becoming angry and you realize like this is an issue? Is it just through understanding that by thinking, hey, if my 16-year-old niece, what would she think, right? Is it that switch, or are there other strategies that can be used to flip the switch from the primal part of your brain to the thinking part of your brain?
Well, I think, Brian, you highlight a number of challenges that people will have. So first, when you're in the moment, it's hard to know that your behavior is problematic because you're just sort of following the flow of things.
Yeah.
And it's perfectly logical if you're following the flow of things that like, this is what I should do next. And the thing I should do next is to react and behave in the following way. So one of the things I think, if you want to improve your self-control, that you have to be able to do is to recognize what are your triggers, right? If it's about anger, what are the triggers that make you get angry and then behave in the way that you don't want to? If it's about saving money, what are the triggers that lead you to spend your money instead? What are the barriers for you from saving it? If it's about, not eating this particular type of food or eating more of that particular kind of food, I think it's important to understand what your triggers and barriers are. And I think that requires a little bit of self-discovery. Then what you have to be able to do is, in the heat of the moment, to be able to recognize that I'm in the heat of the moment.
Yeah.
And then to bring to bear all the different strategies that you might want to bring to bear. For me, and this is what my research suggests, that one of the most important things is bringing the right mindset. So in my research, we believe, our research suggests that what's really important is that people tend not to think of these more distant goals and values that they have in the heat of the moment. They're so immersed that it's just about like surviving and getting through that particular moment, or getting what I want out of this situation. And so one of the challenges is to take a breath, to take that proverbial step back and say, how does this connect to things that I really care about? Are not necessarily in the here and now, right? So let's just go back to my road rage example. In my road rage example, it's all about me getting to work on time and this jerk in front of me that's getting in my way. But I can also think of when I brought my niece Sophia into this, now it was about being a role model. Now it was like displaying behaviors or being the best possible version of me. And that made it a lot harder to be angry and to be reacting in that way, in that mindset. So for us, in our research suggests that the more we can sort of instantiate a mindset that is not immersed, but rather more expansive, one that sort of takes into account and takes seriously these goals and values, the person I want to become in sort of pursuing these goals, the easier it is to disengage from the temptation. The temptation means something different when I have this perspective. How to instantiate that mindset is the challenge. And that's why I think things like asking yourself, what would Batman do? Who's the person I want to become? What are my values and what are my goals? Why am I doing this? Are really important. So the central theme in my research is that the key to self-control is knowing your whys, knowing why you might want to not engage in the behavior that in the moment looks so attractive.
What occurred to me as you were speaking is advice that I heard on a past episode with Dr. Mangino when she said that one of the most important things you can ask your partner is, can you describe to me what a great husband looks like? Or can you describe to me what a great wife looks like? And allow them to paint a picture and then ask follow-up questions to really understand that. And I bring that up right now because I'm connecting that with the heat of the moment, whether it's somebody's overspent or whatever is going to cause a challenge in a relationship, and you're boiled up, you're frustrated. Instead of like, what would Batman do? What would a great husband do?
Yes.
My wife has told me what a great husband looks like. How can I be that great husband for her right now?
Yes. I mean, I completely agree. I think having that perspective that it's not just about this fight, but it's about something bigger is really important. The only caveat I would say is people should bring to mind the thing that is most motivating for them. So for some people, it might be to be the best, be the version of the husband that my wife or spouse wants. But for other people, it might just be to be the better version of the husband that I want to be. And for some people, that might actually be more motivating because it's more intrinsic. It's more of a reflection of my values as opposed to my partner's values. But I think one of the interesting things would be the more those two align, the more powerful both tools would be. So temptations are really powerful, and being in the heat of the moment is really powerful. So my recommendation to anyone who is trying to fight temptations is to bring to bear as many weapons as you can. So if that means, so try to bring as many motivations to bear as you can. So this is not just about being a better husband for my wife. It's me being a better version of me. It's me being a better role model for my kids. It's me being the best version of myself. It's me doing this for my future self. It's me doing this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The more of these motivations that people can bring to bear, particularly those that are intrinsic, things that you care deeply about out of your own internal beliefs and values, the more powerful I think you will be encountering temptations.
Is that why identity-based goals are so successful?
I think so. I think identity-based goals are very powerful and very motivating because one, they apply to multiple contexts, right? So when you have an identity goal, it's not just my identity when I'm eating, but it's also my identity when I'm saving money. It's my identity when I'm driving. It's broad, so it applies to all contexts. And we care deeply about our identities, so it's also deeply felt. Again, the challenge with this, of course, is that when you're driving, when you're eating, when you're arguing with your spouse, you don't think about your identity goals.
Yeah.
You're thinking about eating, driving, and arguing with your spouse. So finding ways to create these connections is the real challenge. And so I think that requires a little bit of, again, self-discovery to anticipate some of these events. And you sort of create these plans to say like, okay, the next time I'm in this situation, I'm going to think about my whys. I think doing that then makes those mundane events relevant for any goals that you might have. But identity goals are great ones because they're important to you and they cover multiple situations. But they don't have to be constrained to identity goals. So as I said, I can ask what does it mean to be a role model for my niece? What is it like to be a good husband? What do I want to be for my children? What do I want to look like in front of my friends? Any of these whichever ones are most meaningful, hopefully all of them, the more that you can bring them to bear, the stronger your motivation will be to overcome the temptation. The way that my lab likes to talk about it is the most powerful counters to temptations might be when you bring the many against the one, right? So you're hungry and there's a piece of chocolate cake in front of you or your favorite French fries, right? you are battling this very powerful motivation in the here and now. Bringing one makes it a fair fight, but why are you making it a fair fight? You want the distant goals to win. And so you bring in as many friends along as you can to help you overcome this really powerful foe that's in front of you. And I think that metaphor can be very beneficial if you can identify what these goals and values are.
Listeners have told us that they love the ideas we share on our podcast to manage money in the home as a team, but want more help than one episode can provide. That's why I'm excited to announce On the Same Page Consulting for corporations, couples, and individuals. Visit modernhusbands.com and click Our Services at the top of the page to learn more about how I can help you or your employees manage money in the home as a team. Again, that's modernhusbands.com. Now back to the show.
This brings to mind a past conversation I had with Allie Bullock, who's a licensed marriage and family therapist. And she suggests that if you feel like that you're beginning to get into a conflict with your spouse, to recognize halt, meaning are you hungry? Are you angry, lonely, tired? Are you walking into the conversation feeling these things? Are you walking in with an environment that is not conducive to success? And if you are, don't engage. Wait. And as I think this through, and I think about the fact that you should talk about money probably earlier in the day, not when you're decision fatigued, and with your partner, you should talk about the things in your relationship that are needed to run the house. Can you explain the science behind why it is at the end of the day that we get agitated more easily? It's more difficult to tackle hard problems.
So there's a couple of approaches to this potential question that you ask. So one, I love this idea of halt. We do know that strong situational experiences have a tendency to draw us in. They help us, they're cues to zoom in, which of course is exactly what you don't want to do in a self-control problem, which requires zooming out, right? So if you're in a situation where there are cues that say like, hey, I need to really zoom in, like this is dangerous, this is emotional, I'm starving, like these are all things, evolutionary responses to zoom in, pay attention to your current environment for opportunities or threats. Self-control is exactly the opposite. Self-control is not thinking about things zoomed in, but rather zooming out so I can connect this to other concerns that I might have. It's not focusing on this one thing. It's instead broadening and connecting it to some of the other concerns, more abstract concerns that I might have. Now, there isn't great research to suggest that this zooming in versus zooming out is more likely to happen at what type of day. So what you're suggesting is that my own personal observation would in fact agree that in the morning, it seems a little bit easier to think about things in the big picture, whereas at the end of the day, it's really much more difficult. I don't know of any direct science to speak to that. There is some research on this construct referred to as ego depletion.
Okay.
This is the idea that willpower draws on some limited resource. You can think of it as like a fuel tank or an energy thing. And that once you use it, it takes some time to recharge. So if I engage kind of in willpower early on the day, I need to recharge before I can engage in willpower later. And this notion of ego depletion is really powerful. People find it very intuitive. People can find lots of anecdotal evidence of it. It's been much more controversial in the science. And the reason why it's been controversial is early on, people said that they showed evidence that you could document it in laboratory experiments. They could, have someone do a self-control task and they gave them a second one and they were less good at it versus if they did some other task. So it suggested that self-control really could be depleted, but subsequent experiments have not really been able to reproduce some of these results reliably. Sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. And there's a big debate about what's necessary to produce this effect. I think more controversial is if it is some kind of resource or energy, what is it? Is it like glucose? Is it like, it's not like a real muscle where you have lactic acid buildup and you literally get tired. So like your brain, it's just using too much glucose? Is it really like a muscle and it gets weak? It seems a little hard to believe. And so what appears right now is that what might be happening is that people are treating willpower metaphorically. We have, just because we use these metaphors of inner strength when we talk about willpower, in fact, we even use the word power, which suggests the need to have some kind of energy. People might be applying a muscle metaphor. And those people who believe this more and sort of, again, doesn't necessarily mean consciously believe this, but sort of at some deeper level have some notion that willpower is depletable, they in fact show these depleting patterns. Now, the hard thing, of course, is knowing which came first, the chicken or the egg. Is it
Yeah.
because I believe it's depletable that it depletes, or is it because it depletes, I now believe that it's depletable? There are experiments conducted by my colleague Veronica Job who has shown that if you can experimentally manipulate these beliefs by convincing people it is depletable or it's not, the people who are led to believe that it's depletable show these depleting patterns. So this suggests that these cultural beliefs about willpower that we have can be very powerful and have real life effects. So if we are taught really early on by others that willpower needs to be restored before you can use it again, this can lead to patterns where it does in fact look like self-control is being depleted. All this to say is it wouldn't surprise me if you had listeners who indeed believed that willpower is depletable. Research suggests about 40% of the population believes this, or sorry, 40 to 60% of the population believes this. And that, so it might be very natural to assume that, well, I've just had a really long day. We use self-control in many decisions that we make throughout the day. I am tired. And so it might lead people to make decisions and act as if they are low on this battery, and they therefore are not able to control themselves or not willing to put in the effort to control themselves. Now, I want to jump in here really quickly and say that all of these ideas are based on the idea of willpower. There's been less research to suggest what happens if you use a different strategy. And again, the whole point is that
What would
willpower
Batman
is
do?
hard, yes. And so if I use some other strategy that doesn't require willpower, even if I am depleted, I might be able to bypass my lack of reserve. So whether or not you believe that willpower is a limited resource or not, I would still argue that the secret to self-control is to work smart.
When do you and your partner talk about money and domestic labor? Is there a time of day? Describe the environment when you make those choices.
Ooh, that's a tough question. I think I would agree with your intuition that when we're tired at the end of the day would be a very bad idea. I would probably say it's probably, when I think about it, the tough decisions that we make, the best times are probably on the weekends, like mid-morning, early afternoon, I guess is when we have our conversations. Yeah, I haven't really thought of it strategically like that. I think we've kind of stumbled upon this habit by accident, but it's probably a happy accident from unsuccessful experiences in the past.
Yeah, that's what we recommend too. Weekends, mid morning. Ultimately, the rule of thumb is when emotion is low, cognition can be high. So typically the weekends, and if you don't have kids around you, let's say you're talking about money, but it's not reactionary. It's not like you just got a bill in the mail that you're upset about. Now let's go talk about money. Like that's the worst thing to do, right? It's more of like, let's get into our happy place together. And then let's start with something that's joyful and work our way through the conversation.
I think another tip that I would add from my own research, I'm not sure that I necessarily do it, but my research suggests that it would be very effective and powerful, is to start the conversation by talking about values, people that you respect. And those people and values can include your spouse, right? And this could do two things. One, it does broaden people's perspective because now you're explicitly and directly talking about values and goals that you presumably share. The other thing is that there is research that suggests, and this is research coming from work on self-affirmation, that when you talk about your values and your identity goals, it makes people less defensive. It reminds them that, just because I'm criticizing you for this one thing, I can still appreciate that there's more to you. Right? That is a drop in the bucket, but this is so what I'm talking about is something minor because there are all these other values that we have that we really, usually it's about the self. So someone can criticize me, but I realize that it's a small criticism because I can, my values and my identities are so much more than this small thing. That helps me be much more receptive to addressing. I realize that you're not attacking all of me. You're only addressing this small point. And there is some research that suggests that it makes people less defensive and more open to change. So by having a discussion about values and identities and goals from the very beginning, you set up this more expansive mindset. You also make you can make yourself less defensive, which I think is really important. You may also be able to make your partner less defensive. And then, of course, because you're doing it on these, as you say, on times when people are not frazzled, not tired, not all that kind of stuff, might also lead to success.
Where can people learn more about you and your work?
So there are some. I've been doing a lot of podcasts since the release of that New York Times article. Unfortunately, much of my work so far is in academic journals, in academic settings. One of the reasons why I'm really excited to be talking to you, Brian, today is it's one of my very early opportunities to be able to talk about some of these issues with the public. I have been flirting around with the idea of writing a book at some point.
Good. You need to.
But of course, that's a lot of work, and that's a self-control problem for me. It's a distant goal, but there's work. So I have to have self-control to be able to do that. There is a more extended article in Vox.com that a journalist wrote where they interviewed me and other decision scientists about the myth of willpower and using alternative strategies. And so that might be a place to start to learn more about this.
And I'll share that in the show notes. We like to conclude our podcasts with folks providing one simple actionable takeaway from today's discussion. So based on what we've talked about, knowing that most of our listeners are in relationships, many are married, and we like to focus on managing money together, managing the home together, what would that one simple actionable tip be?
One is really hard.
Yeah, I know.
I will cheat and I will do two.
Okay,
again,
all right.
I think but they're related. When it comes to self-control, right? Again, the lesson from my research is to work smarter, not harder. If you're finding it really hard and you're having lots of failures and lots of setbacks, it doesn't mean that you have bad self-control. It means you may be approaching the problem in the wrong way, and that you should think about some alternative approaches, like thinking about what would Batman do that might make some of these decisions easier. The second one is to know your whys. Now, I think we know what our whys are, but it can actually be really hard to prioritize that this is more important than this. And so I think you really need to know your whys. I had both the misfortune and fortune a few years ago to have a very serious medical crisis, which made me really think about the things that I really cared. So I wouldn't wish a medical crisis on anybody, but it gave me clarity as to my whys. I might encourage your listeners to think about what their whys are. So what do they want their obituaries to say? How do they want to be remembered by the people who are closest to them, right? Those are the whys that can serve as the North Star in these decisions. And if we can connect them to our mundane, everyday decisions about what I eat and how I talk to my partner, whether I do the dishes or not, I think this can be very powerful in promoting decisions that benefit you in the long run.
Well, I really enjoyed today's discussion. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's been great. Really enjoyed this discussion.
Don't leave just yet. Be sure to like and subscribe before you do. And a reminder to visit modernhusbands.com if you're looking for money and home management support in your life. Just click the Our Services button at the top of the page. Again, that's at modernhusbands.com. And many thanks to our co-hosts, our guests, and of course, all of you for joining today.